Hello, my friends. Welcome back to the Maybe Mindful podcast. I'm your host, Hannah Mae, and this week's episode is on spiritual boundaries. This is the third episode of my little boundary mini series that I'm doing right now. We've sort of teared down into the depths of really where it's all coming from. And here we are at the center. We're going soul with it because that's the foundation. That's what is underneath everything. This is an uncomfortable conversation for some people. Some people are going to disagree with me, or maybe they just won't resonate with it. And there's a reason why I have a podcast and I don't just talk to random people in the street about this stuff. Thanks for being here. Thanks for listening. You're my people. So, spiritual boundaries are about agreement. Okay. They're not necessarily an action unless a spiritual boundary has been crossed, in which case an action is definitely required. It's not always something that you can see. Most of the time it's happening at the level of thought. It is particularly insidious. We cannot see it. It's subtle, it's internal, it's easy to miss. At the same time, what I want to say is this is not something that you have to feel too wary of or be afraid of. It's really important that we don't shift into fear or insecurity with this, okay? I'm going to touch on this more, but we are in charge of our minds and our bodies. We are. We've been given that authority. But because of this, there's a lot of room for deception, for delusion, for things to feel true that aren't, and for things to just play out in our minds in a way where we believe them and we don't question them. Okay, whether it's through tradition, experience, trauma, whatever, what we've been taught, right? So this is where it gets a little more covert. When I think of covert, I don't think of the powers of good, okay? So we're going to take a dive into spiritual warfare here. It's not obvious. It's not loud. It's more like a quiet shift in perception. And actually, I wouldn't say shift. Shift brings relief. My association with the word shift is like we're shifting and we're creating an opening for positive change or for wisdom to come in or for truth to come forward. It's more about getting locked into a rigid perception. So a thought you don't question, a belief that you live from, something that's been habituated, something inherited. And this is where there's an opportunity for this boundary to get crossed. And so for boundaries to be able to be held or lost. And we can always grow in consciousness and awareness with this. So people oftentimes think of boundaries as external, what you say yes to, what you say no to. But the real boundary at the core is what you agree with. That happens in your mind first. It's happening on the plane of thought. So spiritual warfare is not something happening in some far off land, on some battlefield somewhere. It's happening through the individual. So I suppose in that sense, it's happening outside of us because you can come into contact with somebody who's extremely conflicted, who has a serious war going on. You might witness like spiritual war being waged on somebody. You might see the conflict or what they're fighting or struggling with, i.e. in the case of addiction, right? But it happens to all of us, and it's happening through us, through the terrain of our own being, of our own inner kingdom. So the kingdom within. So Saint Teresa of Avila, who was a mystic and a doctor of the church, she wrote The Interior Castle. She presents the soul as a castle with 7 mansions, and each represents a different stage of the spiritual journey. The 7th mansion, she says, is the center of the soul where God dwells. So this speaks to this idea of the kingdom being within and what we have to get through on our journey. We encounter many demons, so to speak, and many shadows and passages that we have to pass through in order to arrive at our home. And this is why many people don't want to go inward and they'd rather stay distracted and disassociated because it's too uncomfortable sometimes to face what's there and it scares them off. It's like their issues sort of bully them away from themselves, but it's the only thing that's going to actually bring relief. And so then from a more psychological, like psycho-spiritual perspective, people refer to this deeper work as shadow work, as Carl Jung teaches and references. So through your thoughts, through your perceptions, your beliefs, there's a moment where you come into agreement with something that might not be true. And so what happens is through your thoughts, and the mind is always generating thoughts, through your perceptions, the way we're viewing life, the lens that we're viewing out of, which is largely based on our past experience, and through our beliefs, which are largely conditioned until we find our own, the moment that you come into agreement with something that is not true, you become a servant to it. You become a servant to whatever you're believing. You're either going to be empowered by it, you're going to embody it, or it's going to take away, it's going to be destructive to your self-concept in some way, your self-esteem and your spiritual well-being, your mental health, your emotional health. So you generally can determine if it's based in any sort of truth or not, depending on what it's doing to your state of being, largely. If something is diminishing, that's a pretty good signal. If it's a belief or some self-talk or some kind of narrative that's running, like it's probably not founded, not grounded in something truthful or loving, right? It's actually pretty easy to assess if we really distill it down like that. And then we become a servant to it. So it now has power. For better or worse, it has power. And this is where we give over our authority, i.e. delusional thinking. We don't do it consciously, we do it unconsciously. But once we start to see this pattern, we have the ability to do differently and choose differently. So oftentimes it comes in through fear, okay? And fear is not neutral. Intuition is largely neutral, okay? Fear pressures, it distorts, it bullies, it lies. And if you're not aware of it, it will start making decisions for you because it's oppressive. It's not of God, and not in obvious ways usually, but in subtle ones. It masks as something else entirely. We've given fear 1,000 different names and we deny fear. Maybe you hesitate, maybe you second guess, maybe you pull back, you don't move into discomfort, and you say, oh, that feels wrong. That's not right for me. It feels wrong. Therefore, my feelings must be true, right? Wrong. Feelings are not based in reality most of the time, as we've talked about before. They are responses that our body's having to deeper emotions in our subconscious, which is where emotions reside, where we generate emotions. And those emotions are generated by meaning that we assign to things. Information comes in, we have an interaction with somebody, maybe it doesn't feel good. We assign a meaning to that reaction or interaction. An emotion is generated, and then we have a resulting feeling, and then we take an action as a result of that feeling, and we think we're very justified in it. But the information that we're using to place meaning on something is outdated most of the time. It's based in our past experience. So then we're letting the past dictate our current reality and our future, and this is not a good way to go if we want to create change for ourselves. So fear feels very real. It's like we have a nervous system response. Your system is responding to it like it's a real live threat. You've heard like the tiger in the jungle metaphor, and it comes in through wounding. Self-protective parts develop through trauma, through wounding. As a child, usually, that's when fears really take the deepest root. They're very old, very old. And we can heal them. We don't have to struggle with fear our whole life. We can actually eject it once we see the truth and we reinform at that deeper subconscious level. So one of the biggest ways that this disillusionment shows up and creates distortion in our thinking is like the evil twin and accomplice of fear, and it's confusion. And when something feels overwhelming or too complex or too big to even approach, it's usually not because it is. It's usually because we don't understand what we're dealing with. It's a big old decoy. So we try and solve it from the surface and try and manage it, but we're doing so oftentimes in a dysregulated state. So you're solving the wrong problem. And as long as we solve the problem from the conscious mind, if the problem is actually subconscious, we're not going to be applying the adequate solution. This is something I've seen over and over again in subconscious work. When you actually get underneath the pattern and you drop into the knot and you see the paradox, like right up close with a magnifying glass, and you're like, holy shit, you see what's really there. You realize that there were so many distractions, so many decoys, and the things that looked like the issue were not the issue. Oftentimes clients are surprised, as myself as a client, I'm surprised almost every time with the problems that I felt the need to go to actually pay for services, like to go see a hypnotist, because that's the route that I go, because I know that it is the quickest yielding result possible. And I'm not interested in sitting in therapy for years, because I did that and all it did was make me frustrated. I'm not saying it's not good for different situations, different circumstances. Big fan of it for helping communication, for families, whatever. But for me personally, if I want to solve a problem and get real-time results, I'm going to go subconscious. When you see the problem for what it is and you see that your focus has been off, then you can experience a shift. And there's a reason why scripture talks about authority, right? About guarding your mind, about being watchful. Because what you agree with has influence. This is where temptation enters. It enters through the conscious mind, but it already has roots in the subconscious. It's very interesting. If you don't question it, you'll start to live from it. And at a certain point in our individuation and in our independence and spiritual autonomy, we need to start questioning these deeper beliefs, even if we really think they're true. So there's a reason why we're told to be wise as serpents and gentle as doves, because spiritual boundaries require both discernment and restraint. The spiritual dimension has much higher intelligence. They have the overview. We are limited in our finite thinking and finite vision, what we can see and understand spiritually. We do not have the full scope of understanding yet. So we view through like a foggy glass. So we have to be savvy and open to receiving wisdom. Spiritual entities, lower thought forms, demonic presence, whatever you want to call it, bad energy, it knows what's going to have emotional and spiritual resonance. It's aware of the chinks in your armor. It knows where fear resides. It is aware of the wounds that it had influence in inflicting, okay? And it knows what's going to trigger you. And this is where we don't have to remain helpless. I also want to talk about not over spiritualizing, because a lot of people do this and I think it's important to be mindful of. So we talk about energy, we talk about spiritual warfare, but sometimes people become overly fixated on this and they disempower themselves by blaming spiritual warfare. They disempower themselves by not taking responsibility for their actions and the recognition that they are already empowered. Like they were empowered before they came in. They're empowered in eternity. Sort of like how this idea that we are healed in eternity, like our true self is always present and anchored. It's just whether or not we're making a connection with that and we know ourselves. So a lot of people take no responsibility for their actions or what they're giving room to access them through attachments. And they're blaming maybe demonic forces or saying somebody has like negative spiritual attachments when really they are attached and blocking conscious contact with God, with spirit through them. Or some people just mindlessly quote scripture and it like you feel it, like they prejudice people through it because they're not walking in it and they're not embodying it. And it just feels so surface. Real spiritual boundaries require deep humility and discernment. And honestly, the willingness to admit that we might be wrong in our perceptions. And that, as I mentioned before, can feel really confrontive and challenging for people because they think their thoughts are God. And if it's making you feel bad, then you might be worshiping a God that isn't God after all. That's a God of your thinking, of your understanding. And the humility to say, I might be wrong. allows for usually instant change. I've experienced it. I've helped my clients experience it. Fellows that I work with in 12-step, we have a lively spiritual conversation. You can have a shift in just one quick phone call. It's powerful. Humility is power. It's powerful when there's an opening, right, for something new. So let's talk about distraction for a second. Distractions equal a disconnect. The attachments that I was referring to earlier is essentially what Christians refer to as sin. Sin gets a bad rap. People feel like it's very shaming, and it certainly has been used in a shaming or like fear-mongering sort of way, a way to manipulate or control. But through the Christian lens, actually at its core, sin does us a disservice because it blocks us from God, from that which we are heirs to. And so I also like to refer to these as attachments. So attachments are distractions, and they're oftentimes us seeking a counterfeit spiritual experience. So this is where like distraction, numbing, avoidance becomes more than just a habit. It becomes an impediment. It's not just like once in a while you check out or tune out. It's like it actually disconnects you and it starts to pull you out of clarity. And then you need that thing as a substitute for what you're really seeking, that peace that we already have access to. When you're disconnected, you're more susceptible to believing things that are not in alignment with the truth because you don't have clarity. That flow, the divine wellspring from within that we all have access to, again, at our center, is blocked. We've like put a bunch of rocks on it. The more distractions, it's like we just cover it up. And clarity comes from alignment and inner stillness. We re-access that inner wellspring. In 12-step, they mention lack of power is our dilemma. Why? Because we're giving our power away in addiction to the distraction, the thing that we're addicted to, that we're invested in, that we're worshiping essentially, trying to derive a sense of well-being and okayness from. So in putting it down, in putting those distractions and those harmful attachments down, then we come back into alignment, and the promise is that new power will flow in. And this is when people get back on the recovery path and they don't have to be driven in their illness anymore. Back to belief and our perceptions, right? We don't always experience life as it is. We experience life through what we believe about it, through what we were taught, through our past experience. And if that belief is distorted, everything that comes through is going to be distorted and colored. So this idea spans many faiths and philosophies and different forms of mysticism as well, that what we seek is already within, but we lose access to it when we're caught in illusion. The illusion happens up here. It happens up here, guys. Conscious mind. That's where it enters. So, we're not helpless in this. We have been given authority. The question is, are you aware of what you're agreeing with? And there's pause. There's room for pause. There's room for curiosity. This is the plane where it's either maintained or lost. This is like the fork in the road. Jesus tells us, I have given you authority, right? But authority requires fidelity. Fidelity in order to continue to embody it and walk in it. We have to become it, or we are prey to these hostile takeovers. It's just part of the nature of this human experience. The personal insight that resonates with me is that we are of so much greater value than we realize. We have such greater purpose in eternity than we even know. So we're targets, basically. And we need reinforcement. And this is why it's good to develop a strong spiritual practice. Like, talk to your angels. You guys have angels. They're real. I'm telling you, I've seen them. And so it's interesting because my spiritual sight over the last 10 years has evolved a lot. And I can see that it was there when I was little. but it really needed to be refined, and I really needed to move into fidelity to that which I was seeking instead of to distractions. And it's in direct correlation to attachments that I have let go of, deeper levels of attachments, coping mechanisms, essentially, and how those manifested. I have a history in addiction recovery, and there have been behaviors, compulsions, and things that I wasn't even aware of that I was just automatically doing. And this is true for most people. Most people are not aware that they're addicts of something. It doesn't mean they're suffering from the illness of addiction in like a more clinical sense, but they can be blocking themselves. And so what that means is we have to go through withdrawal. It means we have to go through a loss of something that maybe we thought was a solution or helping us, and we have to become faithful to that which we're wanting to embody. And so when we do this, though, we expand our aperture. We start to be able to see more, as I have experienced, into the spiritual realms. And so over the last decade, I've been given a lot more sight. And this is so much more exciting and interesting than being deceived. And this is, I believe, as far as spiritual warfare goes, what the enemy is trying to block us from this higher degree of sight and wisdom. Because once we're tapped into that, it's not worth letting it go. It has too much value because you're like, okay, this is real. This is magic in my soul. And I have seen into the angelic realms at certain times, and I have been given insight into certain spirits, both dark and light. The darkness does not scare me. I have no intrigue or fascination with it. I immediately shift focus back to the light. If somebody does have a fascination with it, they open themselves up to embodying it. And so that's not healthy. It's also not healthy, which I see a lot of people actually in the healing world doing, it's like this spiritual narcissism. And it's they take this spiritual authority to an egocentric and narcissistic level and height where they think that they're more powerful than the spiritual realm, and that is not so. We receive power, like I said, through humility and through fidelity. And this is not a path that we always want to walk because there's letting go of these attachments. I did a whole series on attachments where I sort of walked us through that in some past episodes, so check those out if you're curious. But the sight that I've been given into these dimensions, it is really served to create more awareness and to know what I'm dealing with, and to therefore be more reliant upon the powers of good that are our aids. They're at our disposal. And so I think it's sad how many people don't rely on the angelic presence that is all around us. The angels are helpers of men. There's a whole choir of angels, our guardian angels, that are given to us. Their assignment is to walk with us from the moment of our conception until death. And so back to earth for a second. At a certain point, I'm going to wrap up here. This stops being about fixing every thought. We can't control all the thoughts that come in. It starts becoming about something much simpler. And distilling it down in this way I find to be helpful. What am I agreeing with right now? What am I embodying right now as a result of what I'm coming into agreement with? Is it actually true? And the moment that curiosity happens, there's room for a shift and everything can move from there. Thank you for tuning in with me today. I love this conversation. Go ahead and share this with anyone you feel like might be inspired. Have a good week. We'll see you in May. Thank you for tuning in to the May Be Mindful podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review. Your feedback helps us grow and improve. For more information, resources, and exclusive content, visit our website at maybemindful.com or go ahead and follow us over on Instagram at maybemindful. If you enjoyed this week's episode, please give me a follow, screenshot the episode, and go ahead and tag me until next week when I bring you another thought-provoking and inspiring topic. Until then,